Prep 2. Today we'll talk about the last unit, Unit 3, Lesson 1, Reproduction in Plants. But before we talk about the reproduction in plants, we have to find out what is the target of reproduction. Why do we have to reproduce as a living organisms? Why do we have to increase our numbers? Simply to compensate the missing individuals or the dead individuals. Reproduction process, it's a biological process, which means it's related to the living organisms that ensures the existence of a living organisms by preventing extinction, by producing new individuals to make sure that the species goes forward, okay, and not become an extinct species. Reproduction in plants. Two types: sexual reproduction in some plants, they reproduce sexually, and asexual reproduction, another type in other plants. Sexual reproduction through male and female organs found in the flower. So any plant reproduce sexually must have flower. Number two, asexual reproduction, it occurs by any part like stem, leaves, roots, any part except the flower. Sexual reproduction in plants, as we said before, that it depends on flower. What's meant by a flower? It's a short stem whose leaves are modified, changed for a specific function, forming reproductive organs inside the flower. Why? To make a sexual reproduction by them. To form the seeds inside fruits. Seeds are the result of sexual reproduction in plants. The origin of the flower, from which part on the plant the flower emerges. It emerges from floral bud that emerges from the axil of a leaf called the bract. Specific leaf has an angle, we call it axil, okay, and it has a floral bud. From this floral bud, the flower emerges. Bract, it's a leaf that the floral bud emerges from its axil. Axil is a place, okay, it's not something that we can touch. Floral whorls or covers of the flower, parts of the flower, the four parts forming any flower. Mostly, they may change from a flower to another, but any flower that has four whorls, it's called the typical flower, which means complete or perfect. First part is calyx, the outermost part, and it's composed of green small leaves called sepals. It protects the inner part of the flower, just one function, to protect the inner part of flowers. The second part, the colored one, is called corolla, and it's formed of colored leaves called petals. It protects the inner parts as well, like the calyx, but the main function is to attract insects. Why? For reproduction, it will help in reproduction, as we will say later. The third part is called Androecium, the male reproductive organ. It's the third whorl, composed of stamens like this. These are called stamens, and they are many in flowers. They may reach 150, okay? They may be 1 or 2, 3 or 4. The number of stamens differs from flower to another. Okay, stamens form the male reproductive organs, and they are composed of two main parts. Something like string that we call filament, and anther, the upper part. Okay, filament holds the anther, and the anther contains pollen grains. Pollen grains are the male cells. It produces pollen grains, the male cells, inside the four chambers of anther. Number 4, the most inner part is called gynecium, the female reproductive organ. The fourth whorl, composed of carpels, ovary, style, and stigma. Any carpel like this is composed of ovary, in which seeds are found, style, and the outermost part is a stigma. Okay, this part receives the pollen grains from the male reproductive organ, as we will say in pollination process. The fourth whorl, composed of carpels, ovary, and style and stigma, it produces ovules that will form seeds later when the pollen grains move to them. So once the pollen grains move from male port to the ovules in female ports, the fertilization process occurs and the seeds are formed that we can use to plant them and form a new plant or produce a new plant. The types of flowers, we have two types, which are bisexual, which means this flower has male and female organs as well. Like this one, it's a bisexual flower. Or unisexual flower, which means it has only one port, male port or female port. Androecium like this or gynoecium like this. Okay? The steps of reproduction in plant, I mean sexual reproduction. Number one, pollination process. The transfer of pollen grains from anthers to stigma, from the anthers of male ports to stigmas of female ports. It's called pollination, just by transferring the pollen grains. There are two types, which are self-pollination and the cross-pollination. Self-pollination occurs in the same plant, between two flowers on the same plant or the same flower. So self-pollination means the transfer of pollen grains from anthers of flowers to stigma of the same flower or to another flower but on the same plant, not another plant. Okay? Cross-pollination, the transfer of pollen grains from anthers of flower to stigma of another flower on another plant of the same kind, from one tree to another, for example. There are three methods for cross-pollination, which are, number one, by insects. When an insect enters a flower, it can carry the pollen grains and move for another flower, and the pollen grains will be dropped, and then pollination process occur. The pollen grains must be coarse and sticky to stick to the insect's hair. Number two, by air. The pollen grains may move from plant to plant by air. And the pollen grains must be smooth pollen grains, and the stigma must be feathery. And feathery means it goes outside the flower and it's like feather to filter the pollen grains from the from the air. Three, artificially by humans. We can take the pollen grains by our hands from a flower to another. Three ways for cross-pollination. Fertilization, the second process after pollination. The fusion between nucleus of the male cell and the nucleus of female cell to form zygote. And zygote means maybe seed, okay, that we are going to plant later. Pollen grain, and then a pollen tube is formed through which two sperm cells or two nuclei will move. One of them will fuse with the ovule and form seeds or zygote. Asexual reproduction. Vegetative, the first type, reproduction that occurs by any part of the plant except the flower. Any part, like stem, like roots. Okay. Number one, tubers, potato, and sweet potato. We can cut the potato into pieces and we plant them without any need of flower or pollination or fertilization process. Potato and sweet potato as well, we can cut them into pieces, okay? And there is something called eye on the potato. Each piece has an eye, can form a new plant. Cutting, by cutting the stem into pieces, like the sugar cane, we can cut them into pieces, small pieces, and plant them without any need of flowers, okay? It's called asexual reproduction. Grafting means the transference of a branch, for example, from a tree to another tree, to move a part of a plant from a tree to another tree, but the two trees must be of the same species, okay? Or they are semi-similar species. Like oranges and naring, we can move a branch of orange tree from an orange tree to the naring tree, and then we get a fruit which will be orange, not narings. Okay? Grafting between apples and pears as well. Tissue culture means we take some cells from a plant and we put them in a media inside the lab. This media contains the nutrients and all the vitamins that the plant needs, and then the plant will grow up producing fruits or seeds or whatever. Okay, thank you for listening. I hope you understood it, and thank you.